Hi there everybody, my name is David Gilbert. I'm another one of the lecturers in the Department of Geography. Like Ian Candy, I'm going to be teaching you quite a lot in the first term of 2020-21. My speciality is in human geography. I'm an urban geographer. I write about the history of cities. I particularly write about the history of London. But what we're going to do is a much broader, much more general course, and we'll be doing lots of different topics. We'll be thinking about globalisation, we'll be thinking about the shape and the future of the global economy, we'll be thinking about imperialism and empire and its lasting impact on the world today, and we'll be thinking about the ways in which geographers approach different cultures and the relationships between those cultures. But what I want to do today is to give you a taster of one of the other themes of the course, but also to point you towards, I think, one of the central focuses of what we're going to call the geographical imagination in the course. One of the things that gets geographers really excited, which is cities, urbanisation, urbanism. Of course, geographers are interested in rural worlds, geographers are interested in environments, but perhaps it's just my own research interests and passions. But I think cities are places that really seem to pull together a lot of the human experience. And what I want to do today is to just give you some indications of key ways of thinking about cities, perhaps ways that you haven't thought about in terms of thinking about cities, issues that will get picked up in the courses next year, next academic year, when you arrive in September. Okay, what I've done is to pull out three key themes. The first of these I'm calling an urban world. This might be a figure or a statistic that you're quite familiar with. At some point in your lives, and I'm assuming the majority of you were now born in the 21st century, which is rather shocking to an old man like me, but at some point in your lives, our species changed what we were. For all of human history, stretching back into the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, whatever, the early man, we were a rural species. We either lived out in the countryside or else we lived in small settlements. At some point in the last 15, 20 years, we became an urban species. There's a statistic that's quite often quoted that in 2006 or 2007, that was the first time over 50% of the world's population lived in urban areas. Now you can debate that and you can argue about what exactly constitutes a city, but it's clear that the nature of who we are has been changing over the last 200, 300 years with the growth of massive cities, and that has reached a new kind of point where the majority of the dwellers on this planet are urban dwellers. And I guess there are questions about how we think that through, how we understand exactly what's going on. And I think it draws attention to a number of things. One is that these kinds of changes are taking place in very new situations. We're kind of used to thinking about the great growth of cities being places like London or Paris or New York or Tokyo or those established centres. But what's been happening over the last 20, 30 years has been a growth in very distinctive and very new places. Perhaps nowhere is that more dramatic than in China. This is Shenzhen in 1980. A city, well, hardly a city, a kind of municipality with a few tens of thousands of people set in a rural setting amongst the hills of South China, quite close to where Hong Kong is. And what's happened since then is that what we've seen is a giant city, a city of 10.7 million, which, to put it in context, is larger than the population of Greater London, has developed there in South China. And that's only been part of a much wider and more extensive growth. I mean, there are lots of discussions, it's a kind of quiz question. Where's the largest city in the world? By some measures at the moment, that's Lagos. But the largest continuous urban development now is the Pearl River Delta. And again, if we look at this satellite image from 1979 and then compare with what's happened up to our own time. So now the Pearl River Delta is an urban agglomeration. It's this huge, continuous urban development of over 60 million people. A kind of city or kind of urban space that we've never seen before. So I think in terms of thinking about an urban world, what we're seeing, first of all, is a new geography of cities. Places like Lagos, places like this unprecedented growth of cities in China, is turning our attention to new cities, new forms of city. I think what we're also seeing is another kind of change. A number of geographers have talked about something they describe as global suburbanisation. Now, I guess for me, and perhaps for many other people, when we talk about suburbs, or we talk about suburbanisation, some of the things that immediately come to mind are perhaps the sort of semi-detached houses that we're very familiar with on the outskirts of London, places like Wembley or Harrow, or to some extent Egham, where Royal Holloway is. A lot of the housing looks like this kind of suburban form. Or perhaps we think about the giant suburbs that developed in 20th century America, particularly in the United States. Those kind of endless tracts of small, or not so small, detached houses with gardens in this kind of landscape around Los Angeles or outside New York or Chicago. But I think in this new urban world, we're seeing new kinds of suburbanisation. New kinds of places that aren't what traditional suburbs looked like, that aren't the kinds of dense central cities that we saw once before. So much of China, much of the global south is characterised by, in a sense, forms of cities that aren't really like the forms of cities that we've seen before. So I think the nature of urbanisation is changing. It's becoming more suburbanised, but the nature of those suburbs is changing quite fundamentally. Thirdly, I think we might think about something that some geographers have described as planetary urbanisation. Now, for me, that phrase quite often conjures up a sort of science fiction vision of a kind of sort of city entirely covered in houses and buildings and roads and infrastructure. And, you stand on the outskirts of Mexico City, that's the picture here, and you see this vast sprawl, and sometimes it feels a bit like that. People have been talking about these kind of endless cities forever. 20th century Los Angeles was a city that seemed to go on forever. But in a sense, what's being said here is that this fundamental change, this becoming an urban species, means that we have to think about cities perhaps in different sorts of ways. No longer are we thinking about cities as kind of contained spaces, as places that are a particular kind of compact part of the world. Even now, only about 2% or 3% of the world's land surface area is covered in cities. But what we're thinking about is their stretch, is the ways in which, in a sense, the kind of hinterland, what's needed to feed, to provide the energy, to provide the consumer goods that go into cities, that make modern urban life possible, actually now stretched to the limits of the planet. Those geographers that talk about planetary urbanisation are talking about the ways in which the whole of the planet has been pulled into an urban system. Not that cities are everywhere, but that just about every part of the planet, from the deepest oceans where fishing stocks go into this city system to places that we think of wildernesses, yet are touched by the pollution and the climate change that is driven by this massive planetary urbanisation. So we're thinking no longer about cities as these kind of small contained places on the Earth's surface, but as part of a planetary system. I won't be able to use it if I tell you it to tell this to you now, but one of the kind of trick questions I use in first year lectures is to say, where's the end of London? Where's the boundary of London? And of course people scratch their heads and they say, well, London's inside the M25, or they say, oh, it's the built-up area, maybe it stretches out to Egham or stretches out towards Reading or whatever else. But it's a trick question, because what it's trying to say is, look, if you're thinking about the boundaries of London, perhaps they are the world itself, perhaps they are the limits of the planet, because things that happen in London have effects in distant places. Things that make London the place it is draw upon those other places. That connects to my second point, is that I think we need to think about cities as being made up of connections, being made up of networks, of flows, of different sorts of connections with other places. And again, it's this idea that we don't think of a city as just a particular place with boundaries, but we think of it in terms of the ways it interconnects with other places. At the beginning of last month, when Edward Colston, when the statue in Bristol was ripped down from the middle of the city, and then a little later on, Edward Colston had a swimming lesson in the River Avon at Bristol. There he goes. And that protest was about many things. That protest obviously came out of Black Lives Matters. It came out of a longer campaign that had been there that talked about the nature of heritage and memorials and what was appropriate. But I think what it was also doing was saying something about the city. It was saying that Bristol, as you walk around it, as you look at the finery, as you look at the buildings, as you look at the infrastructure, as you celebrate the history of this particular city, is a city that is made up of its relationships with other parts of the world. That protest was saying it's impossible to understand Bristol without understanding the way that it fitted in global geographies. The way that the nature of the urban environment there tells us something, is only there because of the appalling story of slavery, the appalling story of the Middle Passage and the profits and wealth that was made up from that process, and that was in some senses stored in that physical built fabric that's there in Bristol today. There's a geographer called Doreen Massey. We're going to talk about Doreen Massey quite a lot in the course. And she says that one of the things that we should do is to think about cities inside out. That we should think about how cities relate to a world outside of them, and also how that outside world is impacted by the nature of those cities. As I think I said at the start of the talk, a lot of my work, a lot of my writing has been about the nature of London, the history of London. And I think we can't understand London, for example, without thinking about the sorts of connections that were involved in London's story as the capital of the British Empire. And that even today, London's wealth, London's diversity, London's people can only be understood in terms of its position with that wider geography. We might also think about the way that London acts as a centre of global finance, of global capitalism. And again, some of the sort of extreme wealth that we see in London is about that relationship with a wider world. So I think the second point that we might want to take out of this talk is to think about cities as cities of connections. Final point, and it was just a point, that I've obviously had lots of time staying at home over the last 3 months to think about, is about how the lockdown, and particularly the kind of emptying out that we've seen of some of the world's great cities, focuses our thought about the nature of cities themselves. One of the things that we've seen over recent times, one of the things that's been there, particularly I think over the last 30, 40 years, is the ways that certain world cities, certainly certain big cities, have become more dense, have accumulated more wealth, that much of what drives some of the leading sectors of the economy is the nature of particular urban forms, is the nature of particular cities, that cities thrive through a kind of density, not just a density of people, but a density of activity, a density of economic activity, a density of cultural activity. In many ways, the world that was being built through the 19th, 20th and early 21st centuries was one that was very, very focused on cities. And I guess the pandemic and some of the responses to it have led people to question whether what we're seeing is a turning point in the nature of cities. There are already questions about the nature of work, about the nature of social life that have been discussed in the last 3 months that I think are very central to the ways in which we think about cities and what they do. And I think you're going to be geographers over the next 3 years at a time when the geography of the world around you is going to be changing in quite profound ways. And I think what happens to cities is going to be a really, really big part of that. Okay, I hope that stimulated your interests. There's a sheet with readings that should be very accessible to you. It's not compulsory, of course it's not compulsory at this stage. We want you reading when you do get to university. But if you could read through those and just think, I think that would be really, really helpful. So we've talked about an urban world, we've talked about this idea of planetary globalisation. We've talked about how we might think about cities as being made up of connections and interrelationships with other places. And I've invited you to think about whether something really quite dramatic is happening to the nature of cities now. And maybe if you want, and particularly if you've done some of the readings that are suggested, you might want to do a couple of activities. You might want to take a city known to you, maybe one that you've lived in, that you've visited, or one that you've studied in earlier studies. And what we'd like you to do is to think about it inside out. What connections to other places make it what it is? How does it impact on other places? And try to think of the different dimensions of that kind of relationship with other places. And secondly, we'd like you to think about what characteristics of cities, of urbanisation, of that process of the making and the growth of cities, and of urbanism, of ways of life and culture and activities that take place in cities, are likely to be changed in the long term by the current coronavirus crisis. How are cities going to change in the next few years? Perhaps how is this going to trigger longer term changes in the nature of cities? Hope you found that interesting. Hope you found that useful. There is lots more to come in the autumn. I'm really looking forward to meeting you. I'm really looking forward to working with you through some of these exciting themes. So thank you very much for your time.